Hello friends, how are you? I'm Ari, and today here we are for another rune in the rune series I've been making for almost 3 years. Today I'm going to talk about the rune Ingwaz, perhaps more commonly known by the name Inguz. This is a rune related to the god Ing, which I won't develop that much about this deity on this video today, but we shall talk about this deity further ahead, just a little bit, just a few specific notions so we can better understand this rune, and later on, of course, on some other video, I shall dedicate my time to fully talk about the god Ing. As this is a rune connected to the earth god Ing and this god himself, with close parallels with the Old Norse Vanir god Freyr, this is a rune representative of the fruitful attributes expressed in male sexuality, and this symbolism transported to the fruitfulness and fertility of the soils in relation to agriculture. Therefore, perhaps we could say this is a rune of growth, specifically related to the growth of the male figure. In modern-day paganism, the male figure is often neglected as a potential source of magic and mystery. Sadly, in great part, modern paganism still clings to the late classical period and early medieval period notion that women are prone to works of magic. Of course, in time, in history, progressively evolving towards or indeed becoming malign figures of society as the religions of the state developed and gained ground, and the patriarchal organizational structure of the classical societies is refined in the Middle Ages and becomes the absolute ideology of the Western cultural world. So, in a patriarchal system, women in general, but especially those who still held on to any sort of folk traditional beliefs outside the scope of the religion of the state, became these sort of mysterious entities and workers of magic and sorcery. So, in modern paganism, there is still this impulse to see women as the sole symbol of human potential towards magic and the supernatural in general. Mind that I am not denying the great potential and sensitivity women have towards the supernatural sphere. What I am really saying in here is that we still hold on to this collective consciousness in which women are seen as the sole workers of magic of any sort, be that beneficial or harmful, doesn't matter, and the male figure is often put completely aside, completely neglected when it comes to sorcery and magic and interaction with the supernatural through ritual and traditional practice. The stigmatization of the male figure as a practitioner of any magical art led men to lose their sensitivity, lose their sensibility towards the supernatural. A series of rules and canons were imposed on the male figure, a series of social roles to play that led men to abandon the traditional folk beliefs and be far more integrated into the mechanics of a patriarchal system, in which the male figure became the center of it as the benefactor and bringer of justice and righteousness and order, while the female figure in a patriarchal society was pushed aside, almost always excluded from the main elite circles that govern our society, therefore less likely to become accustomed and even to fully adapt to a system which never had much interest in making women part of it. So women in such social systems became this sort of figure opposite to man. Man is the sun, woman is the moon, man is the light, woman is darkness, man is order, and woman is chaos. These very shallow dualistic notions that continue to separate men and women. So we still cling to this obsolete idea. And among many modern neo-pagan groups, organizations, neo-pagan religious manifestations, the male figure is still seen solely as the warrior archetype, and never a figure that can have any possible relation to magic, because that is solely for witches. And likewise, women can never be warriors, so they must be reduced to solely to magic and mystery and witchcraft. So this rune, Ingwaz, not only is related to male sexuality, but also the fruitful power of the male figure and the importance of male growth. So if the male figure is also a potential source of magic in this universe, perhaps we could say that Ingwaz is also a rune of internal growth, personal development towards the mysterious forces that lie within, in the human consciousness, which the male figure also has access to and should develop, lest it becomes yet another brainless follower of the oppressive system in which it was inserted. A system always more preoccupied in defining gender roles rather than preoccupied with the well-being of its citizens and the impact that same system has on the psychological level of its citizens. So, in this aspect, Ingwaz helps to break that stigma, helps to break those social rules towards gender, and gives the opportunity for the male figure to also come in contact and indeed interact with the supernatural, free from judgment, and stop feeling guilty or afraid to be frowned upon by what the society decided it was the proper way of doing things. So Ingwaz is related to the male mysteries as well. In order for the earth to be fertile and to grow and give origins to life and continue to be fruitful, and life may continue to thrive, it needs the potential that lies within both the male and the female polarities existing in the natural world and, of course, throughout the universe. Ingwaz focuses much more on the male potential and its role in the expression of life, its role in the origins and continuation of life. Just as the earth has a gestation period in order to develop and grow, so too the male figure needs a gestation period in order to develop its innermost abilities. Ingwaz is also the gestation process of humanity, but in general of man. And men, certainly more than women, I think, need to embrace this gestation process rather than neglecting it and moving forward, trying to keep up with what society demands of man. And on the other hand, men follow those demands because they are afraid to disappoint their own society and step outside the norms and what was accepted to be the normal conduct for the male figure. Which is why many men reach an older age and they still feel empty, completely outside their surroundings, and have a hard time to achieve happiness and completely fail to have that sense of fulfillment and wholeness. Because they were never in tune with themselves, with their inner child, their inner potential, because they have always been forced to abandon who they were, to abandon their dreams, their deepest desires, in order to follow what is demanded of them in the society they have been inserted. It's never too late for man to also be in contact with their inner child and remember their deepest desires and try to fulfill them. The internal growth and personal development of the male figure leads him to become in contact once more with his inner child and accepting who you are instead of becoming what you were forced to be. And this will lead you to a sense of wholeness, surely. This may be a rune connected to fertility, but fertility can't simply be reduced to a simple and shallow symbolism of sexuality only, as it is often the case in modern paganism, which it is understandable. Our societies, especially Western societies, have been living within a religious system for far too long where sexuality is only for procreation. Sex became a taboo for many long centuries. And this repressive religious philosophical thinking towards the human natural impulse to seek the pleasures of life and to seek the warmth in the contact with another human being led people to become frustrated, resentful, bitter, violent, simply because they have been denied of pleasure, which has had awful consequences in our societies, of course. So naturally, nowadays, with a little bit more freedom of thought, especially in religious terms and obviously concerning neo-pagan religious manifestations, all people think about is sex, which is great. And obviously, you should do it. you should do that as often as you can and try new things. But don't let this blind your perception of life. Fertility can't be reduced merely to a sense of procreation or simply connect it to sexual intercourse in order to maintain the continuation of life. Otherwise, we haven't yet been able to move past this old-fashioned idea that fertility equals sex and sex equals procreation. Fertility is a source of power. It is a flowing energy that lies within everything. And fertility isn't just to make more life. Ingwaz, this rune Ingwaz, expresses the fertility of the mind as well, the healthy state of mind achieved through the acceptance of one's inner child. The fertility of peace in one's own mind and project and express that towards life. Being fertile in the freedom of thought and focus much more on life and be free to enjoy the many pleasures life has to offer. Fertility doesn't have to be just a synonym for sex and reproduction. Fertility itself is life, and life is all there is. This rune, Ingwaz, is the rune of life and all that it encompasses. The life that it is often denied from both men and women in these societies we live in, because such societies do not permit us to be fully integrated in life itself. Rather, we spend an awful lot of time trying to fit into society and fervently want to be part of it, to feel that we belong in this race towards the illusion that by behaving according to what was stipulated, we shall then be obviously integrated, and therefore we will achieve fulfillment and a sense of wholeness. A sense of wholeness and fulfillment can never be achieved by seeking to be accepted in a panorama in which you must become equal to everybody else. A sense of wholeness and fulfillment, I think, is to accept your own uniqueness, and that uniqueness being integrated in a panorama without boundaries, where you don't have to forcibly become something or equal to another, but you just have to be, and by being yourself, you can develop your inner potential. Now that I have given you these thoughts and this general idea around Ingwaz, according to myself, and of course, obviously, as you know it, trying to create a more exoteric meaning behind this rune in the attempt to integrate its power in our modern daily lives. Now, let's speak a little bit about mythology surrounding this rune to reinforce its meaning. So let's see. As it was pointed out before, this rune, Ingwaz or Inguz, is related to the god Yng. Now, is Yng the original name of the Old Norse god Freyr? Was Yng introduced in Scandinavia during the migration period, or the other way around, and brought eventually into continental Europe, and then eventually into the British Isles? Well, these are all questions to which I would like to elaborate on and give answers to on another video solely dedicated to this subject. For now, I think it will have to suffice a few basic notions on Yng. In Denmark, there's the god Freyr, with obvious resemblances to the god Freyr of the Swedes, both being gods who brought peace and plenty to the land and were carried around a wagon in ceremonial processions throughout the countryside, to ensure, of course, peace and plenty and fertility in the land and among people. The name Freyr has its roots in the Old Norse word fröðr, which means wise, but also has the meaning fruitful and luxurious. I think it is a fitting title to a god of fertility. Freyr also means Lord, the Lord, so it works precisely like that, as a title rather than an actual name. Freyr's title was also Ingvi, the fruitful Lord. So that's what Freyr means. It is the title of the god of fertility. So what was his name? How was he called? There's another deity, also connected to Denmark, and bears close resemblances with both Freyr and Freyr. And he too possessed a wagon, and was known by the Anglo-Saxons as Yng. Was Yng the name of Freyr? As the Old Norse people once called him, Yngvi Freyr, Lord Yng? Or maybe in Sweden there was no need to call him by name at all, as his name would have simply been a title, the fruitful Lord, or just the Lord, and that would have been enough to recognize the Swedes' god of peace and plenty and fertility. The god Yng seems to have been a specific deity of Denmark, perhaps not as the name of the Danish god Freyr, but perhaps a specific god or yet another title maybe of Freyr, but a deity also of peace and plenty and fertility, but of the Eastern Danes, specifically of one region of the lands held by the Danes during the late Iron Age, and possibly even early Middle Ages, some influence in there. Possibly even being the god of a specific tribe. And indeed, according to the Old English runic poem written down more or less in the 10th century manuscript, Yng was the god of the Heredings, the same as the Hastingi, the royal dynasty of the Vandals. They may have worshipped Yng specifically while they were in southern Sweden, the Danes in southern Sweden, and then carried his cult to Denmark, continental Denmark, and further east when they migrated from Scandinavia and settled in continental lands. Now, Freyr himself bore the titles Yngvi and Ingjunar, and the royal dynasty of Sweden was known, as you know it, as the Ynglings, and Freyr is generally considered the god of the Swedes, specifically of southern Sweden precisely, and a great worship to him at Old Uppsala. Some of the people who were said to worship Freyr still worship Freyr in Iceland, bore names such as Ingjald and Ingimond. So it's quite possible that Ing, specifically Ing, was another of the names by which the god Freyr was known in Northern Europe, eventually brought down to continental Europe, and obviously eventually brought to the British Isles during the migration period. Of course, this is a subject for another time, but I think what is important to retain here is that Yngvi, Freyr and Freyri, being the same god or not, it's clear that these figures were deities of peace and plenty and fertility. And the wagon was a special religious element in which the god was carried throughout the countryside to propitiate fertility and peace and plenty in the land and in human beings. It is generally considered that the name Ingwaz is the Proto-Germanic earth god, whose cult developed alongside a Mother Earth figure, a cult remoting to pre-Indo-European times, and greatly developed especially in the Northern Sea regions. So Ingwaz may have been specifically the original figure that gave origins to the cult of the previously mentioned gods. Freyr, Ing, Freyri all had wagons in their cults, just like the goddess Nerthos, said to be carried around on a wagon, precisely, for the same religious purposes of that of the previous mentioned gods. These are deities specifically of the earth, of prosperity and peace and plenty and fertility, of course, and yes, indeed, the ritualization of sex expressed in orgies. The orgy played an important role specifically in agrarian societies, and it is more specifically noticeable in pre-Christian Scandinavia in the cult of the Vanir, which are gods specifically of peace and plenty. Orgies have always formed part of the fertility cults. In nature, there is a pause in fertility until the time has come again, and the land becomes fertile once more. The seeds are ready to germinate. New life sprouts and blooms. Just as the same way in the ritualized orgy, man, the male figure, are filled with energy and substance and ready to originate life. The orgy expresses the chaotic, mystical atmosphere that existed before creation, before the origins of life, and as such, the orgy is a ritual reenactment of the primordial chaos and makes it possible for creation to be repeated, being expressed once more within the human world as well. This is not New Age stuff. This is actually well expressed in ancient societies, as I said, especially agrarian ones and within, obviously, fertility cults. So, just like in nature, humankind also has a period of retaining energy and substance until it's time to reenact the primordial chaos and the origins of creation and release that contained energy and substance to create new life and enter in a gestation period. This might obviously seem a little bit silly to some people nowadays, but ancient cultures, especially tied to the land, ritual was part of the everyday life of ordinary people. And their cycles of life were very much in accordance with the cycles of nature. So, sexual intercourse and orgies were highly ritualized in specific seasonal moments when the powers of fertility in nature, expressed in nature, were stronger and at their highest potential. It was a good omen, and so people acted in the same way to take advantage of the flowing, life-giving powers of nature, which were in abundance at a specific season. And so, through ritualized sexual activity, the human being harnessed such powers from the natural world to recreate the mythical primordial creation among mankind. And in the cultivated soils and among animals, of course, obviously, among everything the human being used and needed as a resource to ensure survival and the continuation of life. So there was a time to store energy and substance in the belief that by holding it within, it would be a lot more powerful, stronger, with a lot more potential, and therefore with higher chances of success in the creation of new life when finally the time came to release the stored energy, release the substance that was gradually accumulated, and then such potential and energy is suddenly released to propitiate life and be successful in the attempt. Just as the same way in nature, the very energy and substance of nature is progressively stored as the colder months settle in, and with the melting of the snows later on, nature too releases the stored energy, and there is a sudden emergence of life at the very climax of fertility. The more energy and substance that is accumulated, the higher the success in fertility terms for the creation and the continuation of life. In ancient societies that retained animistic worldviews, the life-giving powers of nature were flowing energy released not only by the divinities of the earth, but also real supernatural forces and entities that the human being made great efforts to achieve and to obtain by behaving in accordance to the behavior of the natural world, in, of course, an animistic worldview. The life-giving powers of the divine are the forces that penetrate the earth to originate life. So it's no coincidence that fertility deities often come in pairs, such as Freyr and Freyja. As said before, Freyr, Freyri, and Ing rode a wagon, just as the goddess of the earth, Nerthos, which was carried on a wagon as well, at a specific time when continental Germanic tribes put aside their differences, set aside all weapons, and gave themselves to the ritual and feast around the cult of Nerthos to propitiate fertility, peace and plenty, and to embrace that power. The same way in Scandinavia, Freyr was carried on a wagon to bless the land with his life-giving powers, and indeed his own sister, Freyja, is his lover, combining their fertility and life-giving powers to propitiate new life. Of course, this idea of incest, we could extensively speak about this. Sexual relations with a first-degree relative, be that parent or sibling, are almost universally forbidden, even in ancient times. And Greece and Rome, as you know it, had specific laws concerning this. But things have almost always been quite different among royalty, among nobility in general. Within a royal family, there were several combinations of relationship through marriage as a means of perpetuating the royal lineage. Remember that Freyr means lord, the lord, and Freya means lady, the lord and lady, and they were highly worshipped by the nobility. And indeed, both the royal line of the Swedes, the Ynglings, and of the Danes are said to have originated from Freyr and Freydi, respectively. So this incest aspect might be a reference to that custom among royalty, which lasted until quite late, especially in Europe and within the House of Habsburg, with terrible consequences that cost them their dominion by the end with Charles II of Spain, if memory isn't failing. But it doesn't matter now. But then again, we must remember, more archaic societies and people who live in a more tribal environment, a more reclusive way of life with different worldviews, which, of course, have different views about what constitutes illegal or immoral incest. The relationship between Freyr and Freya, brother and sister, might be a later development due to the custom of incest within royalty, within nobility in general. And these two deities originally had a more animistic understanding to them, as simply possibly the union of the life-giving powers of nature. But we must also remember that within the Vanir cult, the regular moral perceptions within a society doesn't really apply to it. The Vanir gods are completely amoral, according to the sources, obviously. To get into touch with these life-giving deities, there was the necessity to act and enact and practice and participate in ritual, in strange, immoral, out of the ordinary and even revolting ceremonies as being actions opposed to what was considered to be the right moral conduct of the societies of the past. The religion of the Vanir, around the gods that are perceived to be Vanir, was bound to include orgies, ecstasies, forbidden magical performances, sacrificial rites, and a whole panorama of activities beyond what the society of the northern people thought to be legal and what was and wasn't within the moral conduct. Now, speaking of Freyr and Freude and Ing, having been the paternal origins of Scandinavian royal families, it's curious to notice that within Skaldskaparmal, the gods are said to be of the race of Yngvi Freyr, which suggests that the paternity of the Aesir, of the gods, may once have been attributed to Freyr and not actually to Odin. And this isn't strange if we consider that in many medieval pre-Christian societies, and of course indeed far back into the Bronze and Iron Ages, genealogies of the gods, genealogies of specific cultures, clans and tribes and even families often began with fertility gods, being the original progenitors, for obvious reasons pointed out previously. And this, of course, as I said, is a lot more noticeable in agrarian societies. I mean, the people were tied to the land, needed the resources of the land to survive. What could be planted and harvested, people needed the life-giving powers of nature, and they were aware of the cycles of fertility and the cycles of life, and were in tune with them, acting according to the cycles of nature, accompanying the changes and living such changes, reenacting them through ritual to ensure the continuation of the flow of the life-giving powers of nature. Now, just to quickly finalize this part and move on to the meaning of this rune when it appears in a rune reading for divination purposes, I think it's important to reflect that Freyr, as the fertility deity he is, in the material culture we find about his representations, he is often represented with an erect phallus. And he is associated with nobility, royalty. He is the Lord, a figure of power and rulership. In many ancient civilizations, fertility deities were often considered the progenitors of mankind, the gods of the elite, and often represented with an erect phallus as a symbol of power. This might seem obviously strange for us nowadays. Why a fertility god with a prominent erect phallus associated with the ruling power, the elite? We have nothing of it nowadays. But in the past, the economic, political, military power was held by the aristocratic authority, and an erect phallus was the symbol not only of fertility but power as well, and the representation of the father of the tribe, the father of the people, especially in patriarchal societies, of course. The chieftain, leader, king held the power of fertility. He was the father of all his subjects, and the leader often played the role of both the religious leader as well, the high priest. So the fertility of humans and animals and vegetables was also his domain, as well as the military power. This is actually quite noticeable in the Viking Age society, sexual symbolism and gender ideologies. Court poets often evoking sexual imagery to demonstrate the great virtues and aptitudes of a specific king, of their patron. Poems to a specific king to praise, to frequently extol the fertility and prosperity aspects of the realm since he came to power, to demonstrate his divine favor and right to rule. So it's no coincidence Freyr depicted with an erect phallus and related to nobility. He is the Lord, he is the Father, and he is the great king of both mankind and the gods. Of course, in Scandinavia, before the cult of Odin was introduced in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden. Of course, this entire mentality could turn sour towards the king himself, because we have indeed Old Norse written sources specifically telling us of pretty bad years of famine. The soils were infertile, nothing grew, so it was the king's fault because of the lack of worship to the gods from the part of the king, which resulted in not being blessed by the gods. And obviously, therefore, the king had no fertility powers, so the king was sacrificed to the gods. Throughout the Old Norse and medieval Icelandic written sources, we have several prominent figures, mostly of kings, whose reign was blessed by such fertility that after they were dead, they were placed in burial mounds to continue to propitiate fertility to the land. I've talked about this before, I think. I have even given a case of hacking the king into pieces, post-mortem, of course, and each part buried in different burial mounds throughout the region to extend the fertility of the land, to the land. And we see this religious mentality reflected in the god Freyr himself, precisely, said to have been a great king of the Swedes, the original king, and after his death he was buried at a great burial mound at Old Uppsala, to continue to propitiate fertility in the land even after death, and propitiate fertility to the land and people, and continue to give people continue to give sacrifice to his mound to ensure fertility and prosperity in the land. Freyr means the Lord, so it's even quite possible that this title, Freyr, was carried by Swedish kings, they themselves representing the god Freyr at specific occasions and specific ceremonies to propitiate fertility, peace, prosperity, and plenty to his subjects and to the land itself. So there is this entire religious panorama revolving around fertility and the divine right to rule. Fertility cults were common throughout Europe in pre-Christian times, so it was perfectly normal to have such a great emphasis on fertility gods, as also being the representation of the progenitors of mankind and even the progenitors of the gods themselves, and being linked to the aristocratic authority. Also, Freyr is the king of the Ofar, the elves, the specific supernatural entities of the land that propitiate beneficial aspects to the land and to its people, especially linked to fertility and to death cults of the burial mound, linked to the burial mound. Do watch this video I recommend right here to better understand this subject, so we won't have to waste more time on that subject. But it's curious, Freyr being the king of the elves, as in pre-Christian Scandinavia, the pagan sacrificial ritual and harvest festival was also somewhere around the time for the sacrifices to the elves. Elves played a central role in pagan cult ceremonies. The elves, the figure of the elves, embodied both fertility and death powers, precisely what is expressed by the Vanir gods. But elves played a greater role in the daily lives of ordinary Old Norse people, because elves were supernatural entities of the earth, therefore closer to the domains of mankind, more approachable than the gods were. But I've already explored this on other videos, and in the future I may speak a lot more concerning this, and and also concerning the sacred white stones found in Scandinavia with a phallic shape, belonging to fertility and death cults precisely. Again, the case of the erect phallus as one of the most prominent details in the representations of the god Freyr. Now, finally, let's talk about this rune when it appears in a rune reading, for divination purposes, of course. Sorry about that, but previously I got a little bit excited and wouldn't shut up. Also, I think it's important to point out that this rune either appears with this form right here, as is recurrent in the Elder Futhark sequence, or this far more famous form, this one right here, as we find in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. That's right. This rune doesn't exist in the younger Futhark, also called Scandinavian runes, precisely a reduced form of the Elder Futhark developed in Scandinavia in the Viking period, precisely when there were phonetic changes that led to a considerable number of different phonemes in the spoken language, when Proto-Norse evolved and developed into Old Norse. Anyway, when this rune appears in your rune reading, it indicates pleasure. All the things we do in life, we must not forget about ourselves. and have some time to experience the pleasures of life. Sometimes we deny ourselves various pleasures for a variety of reasons. It could be duty, fear, honor, could even be for religious purposes. Everything in life must be done with moderation. But there are times that we simply have to let go of everything for a moment, for a little while, and accept the pleasure that life is offering us. For what good is life if we can't find joy in what lies beyond every law, rule, moral conduct, and honorable code created by humanity? Yes, indeed, sometimes we must cross the line, we must cross the boundary. We must step into the beyond. We must have an adventure and seek the amoral pleasures of life, but with a rational approach, knowing that what we are doing doesn't cause any harm to others, and such pleasures must be sought after willingly, with a perfectly clear conscience on what we are doing. Pleasure isn't forced. Pleasure is willingly accept and give what our hearts desire. Ingwaz is a rune in a rune reading, is a rune that reminds us of the power and energy of the earth that is restrained for a time, on hold, stored for a bigger purposes to eventually burst and being released at a proper moment, so it can have a fruitful outcome. So right now, it can either be the moment to have patience, perseverance, self-discipline, to make a pause in your life or some event, store that energy, store all that power, because eventually the proper moment will come to unleash all that energy, unleash all your potential, so you can have a fruitful outcome. So do not despair if all seems to be too quiet, too slow, there is a strange stillness in the air. The opportunity to unleash all your potential will come to you if you are patient and if you have self-discipline. Or Ingwaz in a rune reading can indicate that this is the moment you have been waiting for. All the energy stored, all that potential on hold can now be finally released in a sudden burst of inspirational power. Don't be afraid to show your true potential. Now is the time to give all of it and share it with the world, precisely so you can have a fruitful outcome in the moments, in the time that will follow your sudden release of potential. Ingwaz or Inguz is also particularly concerned with the health, fertility and well-being of man, of the male figure. It often denotes fertility of the mind, or the motivation and energy needed to start new projects. A new job is often indicated when this rune is drawn, but even if this does not occur, the potential remains and is stored, so it can be released again for another considerable change in your life, which will turn out for the better. Man's mental health is also at stake. Overall, this is a very positive rune, but we must not dwell solely under the illusion of positiveness. But we mustn't also think that everything is negative and absolutely terrible, and there is nothing good beyond this. Mental health is a very serious thing, and in our societies, that is often put on hold or not being taken into consideration that often, and this is specifically noticeable on man. There's still that image in our societies that man must be strong, and the ultimate beacons of strength and perseverance, neglect all feelings, become the warrior archetype without time for suffering and swallow all the pain, no crying, because all of that is seen as a weakness. I am not telling you that you must stop being brave and strong or stop being the warrior, but it's time to change this idea that man must not show weakness, or rather stop believing that facing our fears, traumas and pain and crying is a sign of weakness. We are all human beings. We all have our fears and our ghosts of the past and a few bones in the closet. We all suffer and feel pain. So why deny what also makes us human? What also makes us feel alive? It's time to face all of that and let ourselves be human, or it will completely shatter our mental health and we end up lonely inside, completely abandoned, feeling that we do not belong. Everyone can and must be a warrior, but we must also allow ourselves to put the warrior aside for a time and breathe a little. Enjoy the pleasures of life. Enjoying being a human and not denying the emotions we feel. A sign of weakness is precisely denying and hiding all of our emotions. Ingwaz advises men to seek help, professional help, for the sake of your mental health. Believe me, and I'm sure you know this perfectly well, burying your emotions deep down in a dark and hollow place won't help, and you end up worse than before. Seek professional help. I too grew up in a panorama where man must not show emotion, must not cry, must swallow all the pain and move forward, carrying a great weight in our backs, and it just gets heavier. But don't even think of showing how painful it is. You can very well be the warrior, but it's also brave to accept what is going on inside you and seek help. You know why there are assistance and support organizations for war veterans and ex-soldiers. It's not to glorify violence and death and celebrate war and killing. It's to help warriors to overcome their traumas and see life as it is, without the constant horrible images that keep playing in your head that makes you think that you are not worthy to be alive and that life isn't worth living because it's simply horrible and constant pain, and death doesn't scare you anymore because death can't certainly be worse than what lies within your head and all the pain and anguish throbbing in your chest. These organizations are there to help resist war and militarism through non-violent action. War is not the answer to the problems of the 21st century. Every boy and girl that has had the misfortune to experience extreme violence knows perfectly well that violence solves nothing. It just perpetuates violence for no purpose whatsoever, because the problems continue to exist. When some people say that violence solves everything, those are just children living in a comfortable position and they know nothing of the reality of violence. They have such a privilege. So seek help. It's not a weakness, it's an act of bravery. Every warrior needs the possibility to turn off from being a warrior from time to time and enjoy life as it is meant to be enjoyed. It's also time for new beginnings. Ingwaz indicates a new phase in life. To begin anew, it is necessary to finish old business and turn away from situations that are leading nowhere. Problems must be solved, so in your new beginnings, you don't have to carry with you things of the past, of your past life that drag you down. In every new beginning in life, you must begin completely clean and detached from situations of the past. What's done is done. Let it go. Move forward and allow yourself to start anew with a clear mind. Don't worry about things that might come to replace something you hold dear. Some things can never be replaced, and if it is dear to you, it shall stay within you forever. So don't allow that from preventing you to move forward and seek out new things. New and more productive opportunities will arrive, and all the things you hold dear will remain in your memory. But you must allow yourself to experience new things as well and create new, dear things. Ingwaz is also a rune of problem solving, so if a complex matter has taken up your time and attention, its solution is not far away. When this rune appears in a rune reading, ignoring the problem for a while might help actually, because you may be so involved in its intricacies that you cannot see the bigger picture. Allow yourself to have a pause from that problem, move away from it for a time. When you return with fresh insight, with a clear consciousness, the solution will be obvious. Don't act on impulse, don't act in despair, don't lose your temper, and don't let fear overcome you and cloud your mind. Every problem has a solution, and with a clear mind you will find that solution, and perhaps even come up with a better solution than the one you had in mind when you were losing control of your senses and of the situation. It may also be time to take a holiday. Ingwaz often denotes that you should put your house in order. Clear away any rubbish and focus your attention on the harmony of your surroundings. The implications, of course, of this rune go further. Perhaps certain people are sapping your confidence and taking advantage of your goodwill. If so, these people should no longer play a role in your life. You will need courage, foresight, and wisdom to detect who and what you need around you and what is redundant. This rune is related to the intuitive part of your nature, aiming to find harmonization and adjustment in the sphere of personal relationships. Ingwaz embodies the universal need to share and the fervent aspiration to be desired, a search for similarities in another human being. So this is a rune of sexuality as well. The warrior wants to be brave, so perhaps it's also time to have the courage to enjoy the earthly pleasures of life and to express with confidence your desires and explore sexually what you have been afraid to do because some people might think you are weird or may judge you, or because you don't want to disappoint, or you may want to stay within the social norms and preconceived ideas of the oppressive thoughts that have been imposed to you throughout your entire life. Just be yourself and openly accept and explore your wildest and deepest desires. it's important to be aware of our erotic nature. It's extremely healthy, and it empowers us and helps us in our process of self-growth. But this rune isn't telling you to abandon everything in the pursuit of pleasure. There's time for everything. Be wise in the management of your own time. There's time for pleasure and there's time for everything else, for the duties of life. Just don't forget and be sure to have time for pleasures. Live a little. When this rune appears in a rune reading, it marks a time of liberation and the beginning of a new life, a new path. You now have the strength to achieve, finish and create resolutions from which new beginnings shall arise. Perhaps the time has come to complete a project, and if so, make it your top priority right now. All things change, and we cannot live in the past permanently. Life moves on, and if we don't keep up with it, if we don't keep up with the change, we will be forgotten and left behind. Ingwaz shows us the need to emerge from a closed, inadequate, and old-fashioned state. As you solve and clarify the old, you will experience relief from tensions and uncertainties in the new. Life itself will demonstrate the need to move on and to break free from old ways and habits or relationships, to break free of some profound cultural aspect or panorama of behavior, or pattern of behavior, of some activity that was quite appropriate for your own person that you are now leaving behind. It's time to allow yourself to be reborn and let go of the past flaws of your own past person and move forward towards evolution, towards the liberation of the self. Being focused and centered and with your feet firmly on the ground. Freeing yourself from all undesirable influences and using your sense of humor, you are prepared to open yourself to the will of the flowing, life-giving powers of nature. And as such, you are ready to be released with tranquility. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. It's very hot in here. You have probably noticed my voice is already changing and my speech is getting slower and I'm showing my tired aspect. Anyway, I'm glad this is over. Quite a long video, I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för det.